How's everyone doing? It's a little hot in here, right? So I'm just going to do a little bit of a survey of the room. How many of you guys were at Ethereum Developer Conference in Toronto, if any? Okay, like one person. How many people have developed like an Ethereum smart contract before? Okay, like a quarter of the room. Okay, great. So today I'm talking about growing Ethereum's real economy. So this is not really a technical talk. This is more about the culture of the Ethereum ecosystem, where we want the ecosystem to go towards, and having an honest discussion about like the state of the entire space. And I just want to caveat that these are my personal opinions. This is not from the Ethereum Foundation per se. And we just like to have open discussion about a bunch of different topics. So I'll just start with like my point, right? I think I'm going to have 3 points today. One is that I think we should focus on building the real economy, and I'll talk a little bit about what that actually means. Number 2, I think we should think about sustainably funding growth. And third, we should set economic policy based on the maturity level of the project. We talked about this a little bit with governance, but I think there's going to be a mirroring point here. So old SAT style analogy, right? So the real economy is to goods and services as the financial economy is to money. So oftentimes we're talking about cryptocurrencies, we focus on money. We think about different types of analysis on valuation. But what we forget to think about is that we have like a bootstrapping network, a very early network. And on the balancing side of financial economy has to be real economy. And real economy comes from usefulness to the end user, right? So what are some examples? We think about real economy more in terms of like a context of a country or macroeconomics. So if you look at the US, it has $19 trillion of GDP, but why do we even think about that number at all? Because that's an easy way to proxy how many goods and services are being exchanged in the market. So it's just a way to compare the real economic activity in one place versus another in the same, using the same index. And same with companies, so you can look at market cap versus the actual product that they're selling. And even in your day-to-day transactions, like if you buy a sandwich for $10, there's a financial economic and a real economic portion to some of these. So working in crypto, we all think about like what is money anyways, and have these like meta realizations. But this one is actually worth thinking about, right? Money is simply a claim on the goods and services in the given ecosystem. So if you go out with a US dollar, there's a lot of reasons why it has value, but one of the values is that you can go out to the store and you can get what you want with that dollar. They accept it, they have unit of account in it, and for an economy to be valuable, the things that you have claims on have to be valuable. So if you go into Ethereum and have an ETH, you have to be able to do something that's useful in that ecosystem, and same for Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency, any project, any token. So what is Ethereum's real economy, aka what do people use it for? And depending on the audience, you might hear different answers. And this is kind of what you would hear at a technical conference. It's like, well, you get to bid on the space on a block, and that's why it's valuable. And the real answer that you dig a little bit deeper and you ask why. And these are some of the common use cases, like speculation, access to capital, payments, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these use cases. But I think that what I would like to urge like the community to do is we should focus on the inherent and defensible advantages that smart contract platforms have. When people come into the space in the beginning, they get really excited. We all get really excited and say, well, I really like Uber. We should build Uber on the blockchain, or Airbnb, or whatever product, what have you. But I would actually advise, from my personal experience, what's been helpful to me is to think instead about what feature this infrastructure provides, and think about, well, how could I use this feature to provide usefulness to users, and what are the products that would actually be useful? So let's talk about what those features might be. So there are a lot of different features, and that's why a lot of people from different walks of life get excited about blockchain technology. But to me, like 3 of the main ones are digital scarcity. So digital scarcity is about, if you look at how the internet developed over longer than 20 years, it's really about how did we build the infrastructure, both hardware, software, to make a bit very free and flexible to move around anywhere in the world. But if you think about it, it's really a copy, right? When you have data and send it to somebody over Dropbox or Facebook, it's really, I give a server a copy, and the data center gives another user that they think that should have the access, a copy of it. But what blockchain is about is now we have a way to mirror real world interactions. So if I have a dollar or if I have a laptop, if I give it to you, I actually don't have that access anymore. This technology is about enabling that human interaction, but in the virtual world. So you can mirror a lot more different transactions within that infrastructure. Programmable money. So this one, we should really think about, why do we pay banks for the services that they provide? So banks provide a lot of different services. They hold your debit account, but they also give you access to different financial instruments such as debt, equity, derivatives. And it's really a way for two people to transact, but a third person says, well, you guys decided that this is the way that this financial contract should work, so I will execute that for you. But in that process, I will take a cut for my business. But what if that code could be automated? What if that code could be written out there, running on its own, and all you have to give it is resources such as gas? And third is censorship resistance. I think Bitcoin really pioneered this idea. What if a store of value could not lose value based on the monetary policy of anybody, right? So if you have this key, you can go anywhere in this world with a key within your brain, and you have access to this value that a lot of people will use. So that idea applied to an application is also very interesting. So this is kind of a difficult slide to say, but I think that if you look at use cases today, a lot of the attention is due to speculation and capital formation and some payments. But I think that this is okay because this is still early days. I think we need to remind ourselves of that in a lot of different ways. And I think we're starting to see the very, very early use cases around digital collectibles, programmable money, and uncensorable apps. But if we focus on the real economy, as in think about what my mom or my friend that doesn't care about crypto could use with using this infrastructure, then I hope that the usage is going to look more like this, where digital collectibles, programmable money, and uncensorable apps are really the use cases. Speculation and raising funds are innovations, but not the key technology. And in that turn, payments also become useful. So when we think about a lot of stable currency approaches, a lot of teams are trying to engineer a stability, and I think that's possible, but there's different levels of stability, right? There's 10% volatility stability versus black swan stability. And I think one way to actually provide stable currency is to have a lot of usage. The reason why USD is relatively stable is because a lot of goods and services, salaries, everything is denominated in it. People use it, people expect it, and when that network effect exists, that is what gives you stability. So Ethereum's real economy is really going to be the sum of all useful experiences available in the network. So as a developer, what I think about is what can I actually create? And if the infrastructure is lacking, what can I create to enable that? So how do we actually prioritize usefulness? One thing is around scalability. We talk about scalability a lot, plasma, sharding, channels. And I think what I'm thinking about here is we do need to work on the purest way to scale Ethereum and other smart contract platforms and cryptocurrencies. But if that is going to block us for longer than necessary to provide usefulness, then I think we need to experiment around different parameterizations around decentralization. So there are projects that build on top of Ethereum or on another chain that have different decentralization assumptions. And I think that's totally great. I think we should all try out different parameters to see what would work. And number two, we have to iterate with users. So that was kind of the first half, thinking about the real economy in general, thinking about Ethereum's real economy, and how do we actually incentivize this? So there's an incentive problem in the space, which is that it is very easy to come up with an idea and get a lot of attention financially. And I think that there's good reason to do so because this technology is very exciting. It's going to affect a lot of the economy, and it is going to be very valuable. But then I think we're starting to see a trend of teams that are starting to stay low-key, work on scaling and product, and I guess, publicity, attention, and money always comes and follows, right? So I think that's one of the examples that we're seeing. And I think one way we're trying to solve the incentive problem in this space is via grants. So Ethereum Foundation, we're willing to spend a lot of our capital towards grants for companies that are working on scalability, developer experience, user experience, and security, among other things. Also education. And Ethereum Community Fund is another great project where a lot of different leaders within the Ethereum ecosystem came together, pulled their own resources to say, these are the infrastructure problems that need to be fixed in the space, and as entrepreneurs, they would support teams that they fund. And these are amazing efforts. However, from a long-term perspective, this is not a sustainable thing, right? Grants eventually run out. So one idea that I'd like to share and explore with you is the idea of inflation funding. So the idea of inflation funding is interesting both at the base layer level, which would be a little bit more controversial, difficult to change, but also at the layer 2 level. So if you're building a project on top of Ethereum, on top of another contract, you can also have your own monetary policy that uses inflation as a way to incentivize common infrastructure that's being built. So when we say taxes, everyone has like a negative feeling, like, oh, why are you going to take my money? Like, I earned this. But I think that there's a lot of interesting behavioral psychology to think about with taxation, right? Because when you make X number of dollars and at the end of the year you have to give to somebody, that feels a lot worse than, let's say, the central bank just printing billions of dollars or trillions of dollars, saying this is going to go to the banks and that's going to go into a loan and that's going to infuse into the economy. So we can actually leverage those lessons to understand what are ways to build common infrastructure using the financial incentives of the entire group. So I know that was kind of vague, so let's do a simple analogy. So let's say I come to you, everybody in this room, and say, I think Mountain View is really great, but I think there are some problems, so I have a new city proposal for you. And let's say it has all this amazing infrastructure around education and healthcare and highways, and it's just going to be a much better life in that city. But even if we have all of the capital available, the people that are interested, the plan that is amazing, unless there's incentive for the person that's actually going to be building the city, it's just not going to happen. And that would be a coordination failure. So in the simple analogy, if we actually said, hey, for the team that is building the city, why don't we allocate X% of the resources of the city so that they can partake in the real economic growth that we're going to be creating by making this amazing city right next door. And I think this is just really the simple analogy of what inflation funding is. When you have a nascent network, what really matters is that it grows. I think when you have big economies, big companies, what matters is I get 5% more or you get 5% less. But this is not about a zero-sum game, and I think that's why inflation funding can be very powerful, where even if you say you take 30% less of a stake in a network, if that network grows by 50% every year, that's actually the best deal you could have made. And I think that's the idea that I'm pitching here. So when we think about inflation, especially in crypto, we say, oh, that's bad. Like, crypto is about supply caps. It's about the fact that no one can touch my money. But I actually argue that inflation is good because there's a lot of human efforts around governance where we need resources to be able to pave the roads that we all use, to have the healthcare that we use. And those are just analogies of why if different groups of people come together, there's benefits to having common infrastructure. So it's about sustainability and coordination. And again, if I were to talk about this to a cousin who's 5 years old, I would just say, why don't you just take a slightly smaller piece of a much bigger pie? And this is what really it means. Supply cap is not the goal. If I were to be precise, I would say if the real economic growth that is going to come from this inflation rate is higher, that's a good deal. Always take it. So that sounds all nice, but even if you were interested, you would say, well, how much do I do it by? And this is a very difficult question. And we talked about this in the governance topic a little bit, but I would say the leading principle for how much to inflate would be around your view on how much of your vision has been executed already. So let's say you're almost done. Then you should be conservative with your inflation rate because your network has already done most of the work necessary to enjoy the benefits of the network that you've built. But let's say if I just have an idea, and I have an idea and I need all of you to participate in order to create this great network, then I think that everyone should be rewarded very, very generously for participating in that network. And this is why inflation or airdrops or any ways of actually getting skin in the game to network participants is going to be one of the most powerful tools that comes out of this technology. And if you look at this very simply as a graph, as a percentage completion or maturity of a project approaches 1 or 100%, inflation rate should come down over time. It's a very similar slide. So I've done some math here, but we don't have to go over all this detail. I think the rough takeaway here is that for mining revenues, it's billions of dollars every year. So even if you inflate by a very small amount, so let's say 0.1% inflation, as opposed to, I think, the roughly 5%, 6% mining inflation rate, that can still be $50 million. $50 million can just fund a lot of scalability projects, design projects, user studies, events like these. And I think that is the way that the event or the network participants can actually contribute to the common infrastructure that we all enjoy. So we talked about the use of proceeds a little bit, but so concretely, you could have Millennium Prize style bounties for, let's say, the problem of sharding is very important. And if we have a $50 billion network, having a more scalable network is worth, percentages or multiples of that. So we can actually say, if you have a client that is properly sharded for state, and it has X percentage of the network, you immediately get X millions dollars off of the smart contract, as an example. And we have all these other examples of why these proceeds would be beneficial. And then if you're maybe even considering here, and if you're following along still, you would say, well, why haven't we done this already if it's such a good idea? And in reality, it's a very difficult thing to do. And this is for two reasons. One is the kind of supply cap meme within the space, which is that a lot of people came into Ethereum or smart contracts via Bitcoin, and within Bitcoin, $21 million of coins that is, forever, it's really hard to say no to. Like, that's what we believe to be good. How could this also be good? So we talked about why I think real economic growth being higher than inflation is a better gauge than limited supply. And number two, difficulty in implementation. I've talked to a lot of people that have been working on Ethereum for much longer than I have. And they say, John, this is all a great idea, but how are we actually going to decide how much to print? What are we going to do with that money? How often are we going to, and it starts looking like a government. It starts looking bureaucratic. And that's the difficulty in why this problem exists and why there are different DAO implementations that are trying to leverage this energy, but actually implement it. So I think if you have ideas on implementing it, I'd love to talk to you. So we talked about the implementation difficulties. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, well, if enabling usefulness is so important, what are you actually going to do with it? So I know we have a relatively technical crowd, so I'd like to give you a little bit of a menu of like the things that we are working on. So on layer one, we're working on sharding. So not just transaction sharding, but state sharding. So you want to take the entire virtual machine and be able to talk across different machines in the network and be able to scale in multiple more orders of magnitude. And consensus, Casper is working on proof of stake as opposed to proof of work. And that's like a whole other conversation, but I'm happy to have that offline. At layer two, we have plasma and state channel. So thinking about if you have layer one like this decentralized security, how do you actually have application specific or party specific scalability on top of layer one? Virtual machines is, I think, another really exciting area. We have the Ethereum virtual machine currently, but there is a strong team working on Ethereum flavored WebAssembly. And the power of WebAssembly is going to be that it can compile things like C++ or Rust. And if there's a blockchain environment that supports this natively, then you can have isomorphic code that can be written in Rust, let's say, and run in the browser via WebAssembly, run as a server, and specifically to a blockchain as well. So that's another really exciting area. various things around developer experience, so tools, audits, formal verification, programming languages. Like if you're a programming language nerd, like this is an amazing time to be alive. So definitely get in touch with us. And UX. This is about usefulness, right? So traditionally, we've been only doing consensus research and scalability research, but now we're expanding that. We have to support any common infrastructure such as wallets, key management, design studies, things that would help all the different projects that are working on top of Ethereum. We will help. So I talked about a lot today, but if you were to have any takeaways, I would say build a real economy and the rest will follow. We're not in a hurry to have a higher market capitalization or to get more deals or logos on the name. We want to have real usefulness. Number two, we want to work on a long-term plan for sustainable change. In the meanwhile, we'll give grants very aggressively, but we should have a conversation as a community about how do we actually let this survive for decades to come. And lastly, when you're thinking about setting economic policy or governance, really think about like what percentage of like the maturity have you really achieved in terms of your vision, and let that be your guide for how aggressive or conservative your view should be. And why does this all matter? I think that blockchain space is amazing because I get to sit down with you guys and talk about intellectual things across economics, computer science, history, and talk about philosophy and government. But in reality, none of this really matters unless people outside of this space will eventually get value out of this infrastructure. So I would love to add that usefulness category into our repertoire of conversation so we can circle around that. Thank you.